Hi there, my name is Stephanie. I'm the Innovation Team Leader at the Landesmedienzentrum Baden-Württemberg in Germany and also a freelance consultant and speaker for future-oriented learning. I used to be a teacher for English and French as well. Today I will talk about future-oriented learning with games. So when speaking about the future, we first need to look at the present. We live in very exciting times. Our work and daily lives have changed tremendously due to digitalization in the past 15 years or so. This has led to the cultural change that is called the digital transformation and that we must not forget, even if it means doing things differently. And this is particularly important because we face an exponential future and do not know what the future will have in store for us. So let's have a look at what schools in these exciting times look like. And this is not just because of COVID. We have been using technology without changing pedagogical approaches for at least a decade, if not longer. And it reminds me a lot of this image. However, this is the reality of the business world, and this is the world of late Generation Z and Generation Alpha. And even if you don't feel like this concerns you at all, this does. We have been living with a pandemic for more than 2 years now. We have frequent encounters with the effects of climate change, and we have a war on our doorstep. So we urgently need to prepare young people for the future so they will have agency and can shape the future, and so democracy and tolerance will prevail. The task of Generation Z and Alpha is to solve all these problems we haven't managed to solve yet, and all the problems we can't even imagine yet. Just remember how surprised many people were by all the events I just mentioned. Some were even paralyzed by them, and this can absolutely not happen again. But looking back at the past and being taught facts in school is not enough to successfully face this challenge. So rather than sticking to teaching, which comes from the industrial age, we need to turn towards future-oriented learning to deal with a complex, sometimes even chaotic world. And learners need to be allowed to take responsibility for their learning so they can not only understand the world, but learn how to shape the future. So we need to move from this to this. A whole new approach of learning that includes virtual worlds and games. We need to take into account deep learning, so the transfer of knowledge, for example, and skills and competencies, as well as the 6 C's of deep learning, with a particular emphasis in language learning on character and citizenship, so the individual, things like empathy, and the community. And this is because we really need to solve our problems together as an international community. We can't do it alone. This is also in compliance with the OECD Education 2030 framework and the corresponding learning compass, which highlights the importance of knowledge, skills, and attitudes and values that are used in a learning context to develop competencies with the ultimate goal to have agency in the future. While in schools in most countries, the ultimate goal seems to be getting a good grade. There are many pedagogical approaches encouraging the learning partnership I think the people we call teachers and students need to develop, some of which I want to illustrate with examples. But first, I want to explain to you why I believe that game-based learning, so not gamification or serious or educational games, is the key to success. In game-based learning, games are integrated into the learning process. They usually have the qualities of good games, so for example, goals, rules, a feedback system, and self-determination, as well as usually a narrative that explains the system and makes it coherent. So the reward for mastering a challenge has a personal value, and competencies are more important than knowledge. This short video explains very well why this doesn't mean starting from scratch and changing everything, but simply modifying our practices.
And I really believe that if you reframe the challenges, it can make all the difference. I have a simple thought experiment to sort of showcase this. Let's say I gave you a test and it had instructions on it that you would carry out. And to do that, it had sort of buttons like this. And the instructions would say something like push button 3 for 5 seconds, and then push button 6 for 1 second, then push buttons 3 and 5 for 6 seconds, and so on. And unless you carried out the instructions on page 1 exactly, you couldn't see the other 32 pages of the test. How much would I have to pay you to take that test for an hour? Now suppose I changed the word test here to game, and I rotated this. And for the input device, I shrunk the buttons and moved them here, and I gave it a cool paint job, and maybe different button styles. And then instead of using words, I represented the tasks you needed to accomplish visually like this. Note the output is the exact same. You have to push these buttons in a very specific manner to move on to the next page, or level, as it were.
So basically what he's saying is that learning design is the key to success, and that game-based learning and virtual worlds can actually do the trick. And this will enable us to provide the young generation with the competencies they need to shape the future, which also happens to be our future. But why are games so attractive? In order to explain what makes games so attractive to young and also older people, I like to use the hook model. It originally comes from marketing and explains how to make customers stay loyal. It basically comes down to intrinsic motivation, and it works equally well for education and game-based learning. In school, we encourage young people to face a challenge, we give them a grade as a reward, and in a perfect world, this reward would motivate them to go on learning. But of course, we do not live in a perfect world. However, when we look at games, they do keep young people hooked. So what's the difference between school and games? Let's remember what makes a game a good game. Challenges, rules, feedback, and self-determination. Also, there is often a contextualizing story. So in school, the challenges are set by the teacher, the rules are set by the system and may not make sense due to a lack of narrative, feedback is of social nature, and there's no self-determination involved at all. In games, however, the rules make sense, often because there is an underlying narrative that explains the system. Challenges are set by the player, and therefore the reward is of personal value. And most importantly, the player is allowed to choose the way to overcome the challenges and learn from mistakes instead of being punished for them, which happens in school. What is also important is that while playing games, you make various experiences and you acquire different skills. And we also shouldn't forget that games are a social space. Just like many of us spoke with our friends on the phone in the formative years of our identities, or spend time hanging out with our friends, young people today often meet up in multiplayer game worlds where they do much more than just play. The first example I want to talk about is a project that I did with German learners from India that shows how future skills can be acquired. So my colleague and I, we had learners from India, German learners from India, build a sustainable world in Minetest, which is an open source game engine that is very similar to Minecraft. The project was embedded into a very strong narrative that made it authentic for them to use the foreign language. They were actually beginners, so they had a level of German of about A1+. And this is a short extract of a video the kids made after building their sustainable world in about 4 to 5 hours.
Hallo, ich heiße Siddhant. Für unser Energieprojekt haben wir auch Wasserkraftwerke gemacht. Dieser ist unser Wasserkraftwerk. Wasserkraft ist die Energie, die aus Wasser gewonnen wird. Wie Sie sehen können, wandeln Wasserturbinen die kinetische Energie des Wassers in Elektrischenergie um. Diese elektrische Energie wird über die Mesikonkabel von den Turbinen zu den Kraftwerken transportiert. Dies ist eine saubere Art für Energiegewinnung. Es ist absolut umweltfreundlich und schädigt der Natur nicht.
At the Landesmedienzentrum Baden-Württemberg, we have a project called Blockalot. It's basically a website that allows you to create GDPR-compliant mind-test worlds for non-profit educational purposes with a click of a button. There's a session later today about Blockalot, so I'm not going to say much more, but I invite anyone who's interested and works in the non-profit educational sector to join our community and to join my colleague Chris later today. If you are in the for-profit educational sector, you're still welcome to join us and to try out Blockalot, but we cannot guarantee it's going to be free forever. In Blockalot, we offer, among others, templates like the Oasis. This is a world that comes with many spaces that encourage democratic processes, like, for example, a co-working space with communication, presentation, chill out and play areas. There's also a movie studio for role-play sessions that can be recorded. It also comes with a green screen studio that allows players to create, for instance, dialogues between themselves and avatars. There is the European Youth Village that dates back to a project I did with teenagers from Germany and France from 2012 to 2016, back then without a virtual world. And this was a global simulation that had learners invent new identities. So the Germans became French and vice versa. Then they moved into a Franco-German village in Brussels, and they worked on tasks about Europe, approaching them from the point of view of their avatars. This helped them develop an understanding of the partner country and of their European identity. They got their tasks from Machinimas, my French colleague and I had previously recorded in Second Life. The European Youth Village in the Oasis would make such a project possible in a virtual world with, for example, voice chat, things we could only dream of back then. Finally, we have a small number of adventures like the Space Odyssey that helps learners work together towards a common goal. In the case of the Space Odyssey, they are supposed to build spaceships to find new places to live, for instance. A third example I would like to address is This War of Mine, a game on the effects of war on the people. Without wanting to spoil the game, if you haven't played it yet, in this game you quickly learn that there are no morally right actions in times of war. Someone always suffers. You have to make decisions and live with their consequences. It can therefore be classified as a persuasive game. Of course, you can't play this game with everyone. You really need to know the kids you're using it with and adapt your approach to them so they won't be traumatized. But even if not everyone may play the game, some kids could be journalists or observers that watch others play and learn about their reason for acting a certain way or their reactions to what happens to them. This still has them participate, but from a distance, with less impact on their personalities. There are quite a number of approaches to the game, but all will eventually have the same outcome. Players will realize that war is not an option, and it will help them shape the future in a way that will prevent future wars. You could, for example, have them research the war in Bosnia, which the game is probably based on, and come up with a mock trial. They could also focus on aspects of the war, such as the relationship between Muslims and Jews in Sarajevo. The game can also be considered from a critical perspective as part of the literary canon for learners in Poland, or as a commercial game. It can also serve as a basis for audio or video diaries, storytelling, or the creation of artifacts within a narrative. If you want to analyze the game, there are many aesthetic and narrative aspects that shape the effect of the game, and you can also address ethical questions, consider it in the context of how social media is used in the war in Ukraine. You can compare game strategies, or have a look at the accompanying game culture like wikis, communities, etc. From the perspective of creative gaming, creating in-world museums on the war in Ukraine or other wars, or recreating cities that have been destroyed by a war can help shape a positive outlook and lead to agency in the future and to hope. Finally, learners could also create an alternate reality game for their community that helps address war in a solution-oriented way. Finally, there's The Sims 4, which has just become free-to-play, and you could use it with learners of all ages to make them more tolerant. The goal of the game is keeping your Sims happy. Playing the game can be a source of imagination and a basis for analysis. For instance, players can explore gender diversity and different sexual orientations by playing and then reflecting on their experiences in an Instagram challenge. By the way, we're actually thinking of doing that maybe next year. So let's have a closer look. Probably thanks to the LGBTQ Sims 4 player community, there are various diversity-related options in the base game. Anyone can pick their gender, their pronouns, and their sexual orientation. There are also mods that add certain features, such as the gender dysphoria mod that make a sim happy when their correct pronouns are used, or they are affected by certain actions like looking in the mirror, not always positively. The Instagram challenge I came up with asks players to create sims that allow them to explore new perspectives and to reflect on their experiences on Instagram, potentially using a fake account created just for the game to allow for anonymity and foster openness, but also to protect their identity and their personal data. This is particularly important when it comes to minors. I'm looking forward to your questions, and if you work with young people, I encourage you to use games to boldly go where no woman has gone before, and to simply give it a go without being afraid of not being an expert in games. You have a lot of little experts around you, and the young people you work with will be thrilled to assist you and teach you what they know. Thanks a lot. If you have any questions, you can contact me anytime, and I will post the slides, the link to the slides in the chat. You can also scan the QR code to get to them. And if you want to share the slides, you can. They are licensed under a CC BY SA license. Thank you.